and welcome to the second Halloween special of the month. I hope you're all doing well. I recently heard about this case and I know that you love these vintage ones as much as I do, so I couldn't resist. So today's case is about a killer clown, and I'm sure the thought of that alone puts shivers up your spine, but what is it about clowns? I was under the impression that they were always intended to be these humorous, joyful characters, but these days kids and a lot of adults tend to run away in fright just at the mere sight of one. Well, looking back, it seems like clowns have never really just been these friendly, smiley characters there to make us laugh. Whether intentional or not, for a long time there's been a darker side to them. Clowns in some shape or form have been around right through history. There were apparently clowns in ancient Egypt and ancient imperial China, and my personal favourite was apparently a clown in ancient Rome called Stupidus, and I like that name very much. But one of the first clowns in Britain that we would recognise as a clown in the traditional sense was the clown Grimaldi in the 1800s. But actually he had an incredibly sad and difficult life. He was prone to depression, his wife died during childbirth, and his son was an alcoholic who died aged 31. And the thing that people loved Grimaldi for, his physical slapstick humour, actually really damaged his body and left him in constant pain. And it was only when randomly Charles Dickens, as a young man, wrote about him that people read about him and realised what was really going on behind the makeup. Grimaldi was a sad and damaged man who was in constant pain, and learning about that was really one of the reasons that people back then started to associate a darkness and an intensity with clowns. And the idea was born that there was a lot more going on behind the mask than people really knew. For example, in France there was a clown who killed a young man with his walking stick because the young man shouted insults at him as he walked home. In America there was the trend of hobo clowns who looked unkempt, scruffy and sad. One famous hobo clown, Weary Willie, actually was pretty miserable. He had no money, just like his character, and his marriage was in tatters. And then there is, of course, good old Ronald MacDonald, who came onto the scene in the 60s and who I personally think looks absolutely horrifying. People accused McDonald's, and therefore Ronald McDonald, of promoting fast food and therefore being damaging to children, which then caused yet another negative association with clowns. So it makes sense that by this point people are starting to associate clowns with death, misery, poverty and unhealthiness. This, combined with them being around the innocence of young children, doesn't quite sit as well as it used to. And it seems to me that by this point in history, there's more than a few reasons why, over the years, people have started to see clowns in a different light as to how they were originally intended. It's unsettling not knowing what might be going on behind the costume and behind the makeup. By the way, if any clowns are watching this, I mean no offence, this is just the result of the research I've done about how clowns have evolved in the public's perception over the years. I certainly don't mean to offend any clowns who may be watching this video, especially you, Ronald. Those McFlurries have gotten me through countless hangovers over the years. And then moving on in history to the 70s, one man in particular really ruined things for clowns. And if you're interested in true crime, you probably know him already. His name is John Wayne Gacy. If we as a society were already beginning to distrust clowns by the 70s, then Gacy really put the final nail in the coffin. No pun intended. In the 1970s, Gacy assaulted and killed over 35 men, and during that same period of time he also frequently entertained children dressed as a clown. So the combination of those two things really freaked a lot of people out. And let's not forget, a killer clown really sells newspapers, so don't underestimate just how much of a role the media have played in this uneasy relationship we were developing with clowns by this point. And speaking of the media, in the 80s films like It were released, and then later on we got the Saw films with that hideous little fellow tootling around on his little bike. I mean, is it any surprise that over the years we've really gone off clowns? And the fear of clowns is a genuine phobia for a lot of people now too. It's called Coulrophobia, and it's really not that uncommon. And that brings us up to 2016, and you might remember that bizarre clown moment we had where people were dressing up as clowns and chasing people down the street. It started in America, and a lot of people thought it started because of the release of the film It, but it was actually started by a PR stunt for a much smaller budget film where a clown was seen in the street holding black balloons. And before you knew it, more and more people were dressing as clowns and chasing people down the street just for fun. And then it trickled over into the UK, with clowns popping up all over major cities and then in smaller towns. I can imagine that those people with a phobia of clowns didn't leave the house much during the great clown uprising of 2016. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that I, for one, am glad that particular craze died down. I don't mind clowns so much, but I also don't want one chasing me down the street either. So that's just a brief history of clowns and how they've evolved over the years, from us seeing them as these funny, larger-than-life characters to potentially sinister beings who we fear may be hiding something terrible from us. To be honest, I researched that just for myself as much as I did for this video. I had no idea that there was such a clear timeline for how these clowns have altered in our perceptions over the years, and I find that fascinating, and I hope you did too. I mean, I guess if you didn't, you've probably already left the video by now anyway, so I could well be talking to myself right now. Anyway, the clown I wanted to focus on in particular for this video is one that was around in the early 1900s. And this case starts in Chicago with a 26-year-old man named Will Warthen, who, after being out all day gambling, comes home to find the door to his house barricaded and the keyhole stuffed. Will knows that his fiancée is in there, which concerns him a great deal, so he proceeds to break down the door. He goes inside and looks around, but nothing looks out of place. Then he makes his way into the bedroom, and at first it seems to be empty, until he looks down and sees a very unnerving sight. His fiancée, Sophia Gertrude Singer's feet are sticking out from under the bed. Will takes a closer look and pulls her body from underneath the bed, and his worst fears are realised. Will finds that Sophia's hands have been tied with a clothesline and that Sophia has been strangled to death with a handkerchief. There's also a slingshot found on the floor. Some items have also been taken from Sophia, including her very expensive jewellery and a large sum of money. Will calls the police, but he already thinks he knows exactly who is behind this terrible crime. And that person is a man named Charles Cramer, otherwise known as Conway the One-Legged Clown. At this time, in the early 1900s, clowns were very popular in circuses, but circuses were very dangerous back then. There certainly wasn't any safety provisions in place, that's for sure, so you took your life in your hands every time you performed. And Conway the Clown was a high diver and would perform incredibly dangerous stunts at great heights, and it was during one of these diving stunts in Detroit that he would pay the price for his fearlessness. One night something went terribly wrong, and Conway the Clown suffered a terrible accident, and as a result he lost a large part of one of his legs. But after the accident, he decided for some reason that he didn't want a prosthetic leg made, possibly because he couldn't or wouldn't pay for one, so he crafted his own, which took the form of a wooden peg leg, and he would use that to get around. Well, Conway was originally known as Charles Newton Cramer, born in 1886, and Charles had a wife named Mary. At the time of this case, Charles and Mary are part of a travelling circus. Mary is a lion tamer and a burlesque dancer, known as the Queen of Burlesque. Well, Mary referred to herself as the Queen anyway, I'm not sure if that was actually the case. And Mary and Charles are pretty poor. They struggle for money, so they use whatever means they have to be able to make some cash here and there whenever they can. And that's probably why Mary had to double up as not only a burlesque dancer but also as a lion tamer. The two don't usually go hand in hand as far as I'm aware. Maybe they do, I don't know, I'm not an avid circus goer, I have to say. But that wasn't always the case. Charles was actually born into a rather wealthy family, and when his parents passed away, he was left with a substantial estate. Mary too was originally a member of an opera company and had success with them as a performer. But for some reason, Mary and Charles swiftly found themselves in financial trouble. It seems they lost a lot of what they had, I have to assume by living the high life until that money ran out, and so at the time of this case they were very much broke and living off their meagre earnings as circus performers. And so as their finances are now incredibly limited, they look for ways to ease their living situation. They want to experience that high life again. And this is where we meet Will Warthen and Sophia Singer. At the start of October 1912, Sophia Singer arrives in the train station in Chicago after having travelled from Baltimore with her fiancé, Will Warthen. And on arrival, Sophia and Will meet Mary Cramer at the station, as they'd arranged to do so a few days before. Sophia had known Mary for a couple of years by this point. They'd met around 2 or 3 years before and immediately forged a friendship. And when Mary moved to Chicago, they kept in touch by writing letters to each other. And it was in one of those letters that Sophia told Mary that she was planning to elope with her fiancé Will. And Mary suggested that Sophia and Will should come to Chicago, elope there and stay in a hotel for a while. Sophia thinks this sounds like a good idea, and so she and Will make the journey to Chicago to meet Mary. But when the couple get there, Mary has a different suggestion for the couple to what she'd originally said. She tells the couple that she's currently on the lookout for somewhere to live too, and so she suggests that they rent a flat together. It'll be far more affordable if they all share. And this makes good sense to Will and Sophie, and so they agree to this arrangement, and they quickly find a place to live in the city, and the three of them move in. And things get off to a reasonably good start. The three get along very well together and enjoy each other's company. That is, until Mary starts to tell Sophia how she misses her husband Charles, who currently is living and working away in Muncie, Indiana. Sophia asks why he can't come back to Chicago, and Mary tells her how he can't afford to return as they haven't the money. This tugs on Sophia's heartstrings, and she very kindly offers to give Mary the money to send across to Charles to get him back home. And Mary is overjoyed. She immediately accepts this kind offer, and 5 days later Charles travels back to Chicago and moves into the home too. And things continue to go well for around a week or two. The two couples get along just fine. However, Sophia seems to be paying for the lion's share of everything the two couples do. Everywhere they go, their food, their bills and their rent. Sophia's paying for pretty much all of it. The Cramers contribute virtually nothing towards their living expenses, and they're really taking advantage of Sophia's kindness. And Sophia eventually starts to think, this isn't right, these people are draining my bank account, they're basically living off me. This isn't what she had in mind at all when she and Will agreed to this living arrangement. And Sophia and Will realise that it needs to come to an end, and they need to move back to Baltimore. But it wasn't just the couple leeching off Sophia's money that was the issue. It was also Charles. He was making Sophia and Will feel a little uncomfortable and intimidated by the kind of things he was saying to them. At one point, Charles randomly shows Sophia a doorknob that has a handkerchief round it and shoelaces tied to it. He tells her that he uses this device to, quote, knock 'em down. And another time he shows Will a slingshot he owns, and he says the same thing. He uses it to knock him down. Will assumes that Charles is just joking in his own weird way, but nevertheless, these comments make the couple feel uneasy. And between this and the lack of financial contribution from Mary and Charles, it's definitely time for Will and Sophia to move back home, and they let the Cramers know of their plans to leave. But the fact of the matter is that the Cramers don't have any money, and they very much enjoy spending Sophia's money. And it's not like Sophia hides her wealth. She wears a lot of diamonds and often flaunts how rich she is. She's worth around $35,000, which she inherited from her father after he died, and that sum of money in those days is pretty huge, especially to the penniless Cramers. Her flaunting her money around them makes them almost salivate at the sight of it, and having Sophia around means that they get to enjoy some of it. Quite a lot of it, actually. Of course, Sophia's wealth and her willingness to show it off at every opportunity doesn't give the Cramers any right to that money, but I guess in a way that's exactly how they see it, and her decision to end their living arrangement and move back to Baltimore doesn't suit Mary and Charles at all. Sophia certainly doesn't intend to offend Mary and Charles. She just tells them that she and Will are moving back to Baltimore because Chicago isn't what they expected it to be. But her intentions are irrelevant to Mary and Charles. Sophia is ruining their comfortable new living situation, and their meal ticket moving back to Baltimore simply isn't an option. The Cramers immediately turn on Will and Sophia, and living together becomes very awkward. Mary and Charles do everything they can to make Will and Sophia feel as unwelcome and hated as possible. Mary and Charles refuse to speak to or even acknowledge them. They won't eat meals with them or have anything to do with them in general, really. It becomes a very cold, tense and unpleasant atmosphere to live in. And this continues until October 28th, 1912, which starts off as a normal day. Sophia goes to the shops, she buys some stationery and then she goes to the chemist, and after that she heads home. That visit to the chemist would be the last time Sophia Singer would ever be seen alive. Meanwhile, Will is out gambling. He has this arrangement very much like Lord Lucan did. If you've not seen my video on Lord Lucan, I'll link it above and in the description below. But yeah, Will has this arrangement whereby gambling is kind of his profession. Will has friends who work at the races and they let him know the results of the races before the bookies find out. So Will is kind of the middleman, getting in before the others to try to make some money. Anyway, he's been out gambling and he returns home, and as we already know, he sees the door to his home has been barricaded shut, and he breaks in and he finds Sophia underneath the bed. And as we know, he pulls her out, realising that she's been strangled to death. Her hands have been tied with a clothesline and a slingshot is found on the floor. Obviously, Will calls for the Chicago Police Department to come, and when they do, some key clues are found which make it very clear who is likely responsible for this terrible crime. More than $3,000 worth of Sophia's jewellery is missing, and $1,000 in cash is also missing, which, granted, anyone could have taken, especially if Sophia liked to flaunt her wealth. But there's one thing that really guides the police in one direction, and one direction only. A handkerchief is pushed so deep into Sophia's throat that the police actually have to use tweezers to remove it, and that handkerchief very clearly belongs to Charles Cramer. Now, $4,000 worth of cash and jewels may not seem like a huge amount in today's money, but back then it was a lot, and clearly to the Cramers it was enough to kill an innocent woman for. A woman who had shown incredible generosity to them, and this was the gratitude they showed her. Anyway, needless to say, the Cramers have escaped by now and have seemingly vanished. A nationwide manhunt is launched for a one-legged killer clown, and as you can imagine at the time, the general public are quite rightly absolutely horrified. A killer clown is on the loose, being hunted down for murder during Halloween. Needless to say, it made national news headlines. I read that Halloween didn't really feature much in shops until 1930, but I do think that people were aware of Halloween at the very least, which will have made this situation a lot more creepy. Luckily for the police and the public, it doesn't take long to catch the Cramers, and just a few days after the murder, they're found near to where Charles grew up, in his hometown of Ohio. It seems to me that Ohio is a strange choice, given that if people are going to recognise you anywhere, it's going to be in the town that you were raised in. Surely a lot of the locals would know exactly who you are there, more so than any location in the entire country. When the Cramers are found, the police also discover with them some of Will's clothes, which they claim Sophia had gifted to them before they left, saying that she was planning on leaving Will. I'm pretty sure that was a complete lie. Once they're taken to the station, Mary immediately confesses, and once she's confessed and Charles finds out, he then agrees to confess too. They say that this whole thing was an accident, and they didn't intend on hurting Sophia, they only wanted to rob her. And the way that Charles acts when he's arrested from there on out really is quite strange. He keeps cracking jokes and acting the clown, I guess. It was really quite disturbing. He specifically stops the police questioning to crack a joke. He says, "Say, Captain, do you know that in this case you can't hang a man with a wooden leg?" And the captain says, "No," to which Charles replies, "You have to use a rope." When asked about how he hurt his leg, he answered that a steamboat had run over it. They're not the best jokes I've ever heard, to say the least, so it's not surprising he wasn't making any money as a clown and ended up having to rob people. During his confession, Charles insists that even though Mary has confessed, she had nothing to do with it. Charles says that his wife has nothing to do with this murder because actually this murder was committed by him in self-defence. Charles tells the police that on the day of the murder, Mary, himself and Sophia were all at home and Will was out gambling. At some point during that time, Sophia walks into their room and immediately starts an argument with them. And during this argument, Sophia apparently says that Mary should turn to prostitution if the couple need money. Apparently it's at this point that Charles says Mary leaves the room, and now that Charles and Sophia are alone, Sophie apparently attacks him with a doorknob that has a handkerchief and shoelaces tied to it. Charles says that there's a struggle and he manages to take the doorknob off Sophia. He knocks her unconscious, ties her up and leaves the room to go to the kitchen to tell Mary that they need to leave immediately. Charles says, "I killed her in self-defence. I only did what 9 out of 10 other men would have done in similar circumstances." Notice there's absolutely no mention of strangulation there, or his handkerchief being in her throat. The police say his confession is full of holes and makes virtually no sense at all. And so after their confessions, the case goes to trial in March 1913. And this trial makes front page news, even overshadowing Woodrow Wilson's inauguration as president. But the beginning of the trial doesn't go smoothly, because both Cramers recant their confessions. They say that the police forced them into confessing by restricting access to food and medicine, and so making them weak and easily coerced into confessing. And in actual fact, the judge does throw out both Mr. and Mrs. Cramer's confessions. Throughout the trial, Charles is totally carefree, cracking jokes and completely nonchalant the entire time. And perhaps that is what sealed their fate, because even though the confessions were thrown out, the jury find them both guilty of murder. Charles is sentenced to life at the Joliet Correctional Centre, which he is very lucky to receive, as usually for a murder such as this, there's a huge chance he could be hanged for his crime. And Mary is sentenced to 14 years in prison. The jury believe that she was complicit in the robbery and so was also responsible in some part for the murder too. But whilst Mary is sentenced to 14 years, she actually only serves 1 year of that sentence. Charles, on the other hand, is furious that he's been convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, and as he's taken away, he promises to anyone who's listening that he is, quote, going to get out of this. And this time, the Joker wasn't joking. And in 1925, 12 years after he's sentenced to life, Charles Cramer is working on a prison farm and decides to make a run for it. Even though he's still wearing the wooden leg he crafted himself, he manages to run fast enough to avoid the prison guards and to completely vanish. It's said that he's spotted once 4 years later in Toledo in 1929, but he isn't ever captured by police, and Chicago's killer clown is never seen again. And in case you're wondering whether Charles, or Conway the One-Legged Clown, really was responsible for this murder, well, maybe this will help you make up your mind. In 1908, so 4 years before Sophia was killed, there was a murder which took place in Chicago. A lady named Frances Thompson was found strangled in her own home. She'd also been robbed. There was a suspect in this case, a person named Luman Mann, and he did get arrested and went to trial for this murder, but he was ultimately acquitted. Now, admittedly, just because this was the strangulation of a woman in Chicago, it doesn't exactly directly link Charles to this crime. Except for one thing. Luman Mann's father, Orville, received a note, and this note read that Orville could solve this crime himself. It read that if he went to an amusement park called Riverview, the case would be solved, because there he would find the killer, a clown with a wooden leg. Unfortunately, Orville didn't do what the note told him to. He probably thought it was someone playing a very bizarre trick on him, or perhaps he told the police and maybe they told him it wasn't worth following up on. But either way, I think it's safe to say that had they known just 4 years later a clown with a wooden leg would be tried for the strangulation and robbery of a woman in Chicago, they might have taken it a lot more seriously. Knowing that Conway the Clown was never seen again, we can't possibly know what he got up to afterwards or where he went. He would certainly have needed money, and his method of getting money was brutal to say the least. So just how many victims of Chicago's killer clown was there? I guess we'll never know. Thankfully, Conway the Killer Clown would be around 134 years old today, so I don't think we need to worry about him anymore. But I guess you never know when the next killer clown could pop up. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. I've got a lot more videos planned and I'd love for you to stick around to see them. Have a great day, stay safe and happy Halloween. Bye bye.